Welcome to Civics and Coffee. My name is Alicia, and I am a self-professed history nerd. Each week, I'm going to chat about a topic on U.S. history and give you both the highlights and occasionally break down some of the complexities in history and share stories you may not remember learning in high school, all in the time it takes to enjoy a cup of coffee. Hey everyone, welcome back. A few weeks ago, I had the honor of welcoming Dr. Donna Nichol on the show to discuss her newest book, Black Woman on Board. Dr. Nichol earned her doctorate degree in educational studies from Ohio State University, where she specialized in history and philosophy of higher education. Her research interests are race, conservative philanthropy, and U.S. higher education, and the history of African American women's educational activism. We held our conversation over Zoom, so I'm inserting my normal sound quality warning here. Enjoy. Welcome back, everyone. With me today is Dr. Donna Nichol. She is the Associate Dean of Personnel and Curriculum and Professor of History in the College of Liberal Arts at California State University, Long Beach, and is the author of Black Woman on Board, Claudia Hampton, the California State University, and the Fight to Save Affirmative Action, which will be the focus of our conversation today. Welcome, Dr. Nichol.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on. Let's dive on in. So, who was Claudia Hampton, and how did Reagan choose her to be on the California State University Board of Trustees?
All right. So Claudia Hampton was an educator originally from Chicago, who eventually moved to Los Angeles. She taught in LA Unified School District for a number of years before she was tapped to be the director of a new office called Schools and Community Relations, which came about after the Watts Rebellion in 1965 and the McCone Commission recommendations in 1968 to deal with the desegregation of Los Angeles Unified School District. So it was her job to go out and triage race flare-ups throughout the district. Eventually, because of her participation in civic organizations, particularly the Los Angeles chapter of the NAACP, she was asked to attend a meeting with Ronald Reagan's education secretary, a man by the name of Alex Sheriffs. And in that meeting, sheriffs typically gave people about 20 minutes to talk about whatever issues they had regarding education. Well, the NAACP wanted to talk about busing and desegregation. But instead of one person going, it ended up being a group of like 12 people. And Claudia Hampton was among that group. He was so enthralled with the conversation that it went much longer than 20 minutes. And out of that started a kind of vetting process, just talking to this group of 12 that whittled down to Claudia Hampton. So when Sheriffs was getting ready to be appointed as the vice chancellor for academic affairs for the Cal State system, Sheriffs asked Ronald Reagan, who was the outgoing governor, if he would appoint Claudia Hampton to this position as the first Black woman trustee. There was a Black male trustee who served under Pat Brown, but he didn't stay on the board that long, and he didn't really do a lot. But Claudia Hampton ended up becoming the first Black woman trustee in 1974, and she served on the board for 20 years.
Yeah. And had a pretty transformative career as well, as we will get into. And you start your book by saying that Hampton is an example of the long tradition of educational activism performed by Black women. So how did other women make Hampton's role possible?
Yeah, so if we want to go back much further than Hampton's contemporaries, you can look at women like Mary McLeod Bethune, who influenced educational policy at the federal level. She created Bethune-Cookman College. So there is an example of Black women kind of using what I call in the book kind of developmental leadership, where it's community informed type of leadership to get policies and programs in place that would help further Black student success and so forth. And so, if we want to talk about in a contemporary sense, while Hampton is serving in California, across the country in North Carolina, you have a woman by the name of Bertha Maxwell Roddy, who is first Black school principal in Charlotte, North Carolina. She eventually becomes one of the founders of the first Black Studies program at UNC Chapel Hill, and she helps to create the National Council for Black Studies. In California, there are other examples. So you have Eva Patterson, who's a Black woman who's an attorney who is fighting to keep affirmative action in place. So she actually fights against the Bakke decision in 1978. And then again in the 90s, when Ward Connerly in California is trying to get rid of race data in medicine, she successfully petitions and fights against banning the collection of race data. So there are plenty of examples of Black women who are working very hard and diligently to promote education. But really, an important key figure for Hampton is a woman by the name of Verna Canson. The Verna Canson was the West Coast director of the NAACP, who did not have an education background, whose most of her background was in credit unions and banking. But what she did was she facilitated the conversation between Alex Sheriffs and Claudia Hampton. She made it possible because she knew she did not have the educational background to talk to him about busing and desegregation of schools. So she called around the local chapters in California and put Hampton in play to work with Alex Sheriffs.
Yeah. And one of the other kind of major themes of your book is this concept of sly civility. So, what is sly civility, and how did Hampton use it to her advantage?
Yeah, so sly civility was a term that was coined by cultural theorist Homi Bhabha. And in that iteration, Homi Bhabha's talking about colonial India. And he's saying that for Indians, in order to resist colonization by the British, they're going to have to infiltrate these British institutions that are now in India and behave civilly toward the British so that they can learn their resources and their knowledge and their know-how, and then pass all of that information and knowledge back to the Indian people so that Indian people can resist British colonization. So it's a resistance strategy, but it's more of a kind of pragmatic resistance strategy. So you're not going and fighting hand-to-hand combat with people because you recognize that there is a penchant for violence by people who have colonized you. So in Hampton's case, sly civility looks like her building relationships with the mostly white men on the board, developing personal relationships. She ends up, and I have a chapter in the book called The Conciliator Makes Dinner, and it's about her cooking dinner in order to gain entree into the informal telephone network where all the decisions were made. But she had been excluded from that for the first 2 or 3 years on the board. And she said, hey, in order to, get any policies done, I have to be a part of this informal network. And so first she observed who was the power players on the board. And then she said, I'm going to start to invite them to dinner at my house. So she cooks dinner for them, and that gives her entree into this telephone network. And so throughout the book, there are examples of her using sly civility, whether it's attending meetings that have nothing to do with her assignment so that she can stay apprised of what's going on. So if it will impact affirmative action later on or whatever policies that she's, fighting for. So it's really it's really kind of grounded in a kind of pragmatism
Hmm.
that you're going to have to make nice with people who might not like you.
Yeah, and I think you highlight pretty well of how effective she was in leveraging that concept and that tool to get some pretty substantive changes. So it's pretty smart on her end.
Yeah, when I was trying to like kind of make sense of what she was doing, I struggled. I'm not going to lie. I walked away from the project for about 6 months because I just didn't have the language to explain what she was doing. And then I attended a conference, and it was a conference on philanthropy, and philanthropy is one of my other areas. So I'm sitting in there and they're just talking about how African Americans at HBCUs, the development officers, use sly civility to court white donors. And as soon as they said it, I said, "Oh my God, that's it. That's it." I remember this from grad school, and it started to make sense to me.
Yeah.
You know, and I was raised in the Black radical tradition, so to write about someone who is talking about pragmatism and being like a liberal insider is like the antithesis of how I was trained. But I got humbled really quickly because I saw how effective she was.
Yeah. And speaking to the context of the moment, how did student activism kind of force action by then the California State College system?
Yeah, so a really important piece that I wanted to make sure I attended to is that it's the agitation of students that forces California to change. It's not, we have this type of mythology that California is this kind of liberal, progressive utopia, but really it's the agitation by students in the 60s in particular that forces, those in authority to step back and come to terms with these demands for change. And so, we have affirmative action in 65, but it doesn't really get enforced across the nation until the early 70s. And in California, you have the student activists at San Jose State, San Francisco State, and then eventually all over the Cal State system pushing for implementation of Black Studies programs, scholarship programs for students of color, housing, Greek life, all of these things. It what those protests do is they really transform this notion of education as a public interest into a public good. So the public interest is always associated with finance. Let's keep tabs on the money. But what the students do is they force a type of public good where access to the institution is more important than finance.
Yeah.
And so you need you need that agitation on the outside, and you need someone like a Claudia Hampton on the inside to marry those two things together. I think people get very wedded in an either or, where either we're going to have all, agitation, but you also need someone who's going to help develop policy on the inside. And so I wanted to make sure that we understood why a Claudia Hampton is necessary. She's necessary because these students are agitating, and she needs to be able to translate their anger and their frustration into something tangible.
Yeah. And kind of the sense of community and coalition building, how did women's rights organizations kind of contribute to the enforcement of affirmative action?
Yes, like I said, affirmative action was created with an executive order in 1965, but there were no implementation rules that were established. The policy just came about and nothing really happened. Women didn't get added into the policy until 1967, so 2 years later. And what a lot of women were finding was that, when they would go to apply for a job or a promotion, the affirmative action rules were not being honored. And so a group of feminist organizations, particularly the Women's Equity Action League, because they were focused on higher education. They started to petition the Office of Housing, Education, and Welfare, which is now the Department of Ed. They started to petition and say, we're going to sue you for violating, the affirmative action rules. And that's when the federal government is like, oh, hold on. Here are the implementation rules, and in fact, we're going to make a distinction between non-discrimination and affirmative action, because a lot of universities were using non-discrimination as the stand-in for affirmative action. They're not the same thing. Non-discrimination says you can't bar someone because of their race, their gender, their religion, and so on. But affirmative action says you're going to take very clear steps to recruit people because they are from these protected classes, their race, their gender, their national origin. And so these feminist groups that are petitioning forces universities to stop trying to sidestep the law by saying, well, we've enforced non-discrimination. That's affirmative action. They're not the same thing.
And you kind of touched on this in some of your previous answers, but what were some of the roadblocks to the CSU system implementing affirmative action prior to Dr. Hampton's arrival?
Yeah. So the the policy was in place, but the implementation is always the tricky part.
Mm-hmm.
And so some of the roadblocks mostly had to do with finances. Where was the money going to come from for these recruitment programs? And to be clear, in California, affirmative action only applied to faculty and staff up until the 1980s, when you have um, an Assembly Concurrent Resolution 151 that requires student affirmative action by 1980. So California, the Cal State system, not all of California, the Cal State system is actually quite slow in implementing affirmative action for students. But before that, before Dr. Hampton comes on the board, there's a struggle to get money to pay for all of these things. There's also some groups that see themselves as civil rights organizations, the Anti-Defamation League, who are actually fighting against affirmative action, saying that it doesn't take into consideration the white majority. So it's a kind of strange thing that you have a policy to help protect the minority, but you have a group that fashions themselves as a civil rights organization saying, well, we got to protect the white majority. And there's all of this kind of foot dragging and slow walking the enforcement of affirmative action, whether it was coming from the CSU itself or if it was coming from whoever was governor at the time. So in this case, Jerry Brown. So Jerry Brown slow walks affirmative action by not funding it. So every time he would do a budget, he would take out all the budget requests for affirmative action, but curiously put in money for the EOP programs, the educational opportunity programs. So he would pay for pre-college programs, but he would not pay for programs that would help students once they got admitted or help to recruit faculty and staff.
Mm-hmm. And in giving the kind of brief synopsis of Hampton's experience, you talked about how she was part of the Los Angeles School District. So how did Dr. Hampton's prior experience with the Los Angeles School District prepare her for her role with the Board of Trustees?
Yeah, I would say it prepared her a great deal because she interfaced with different people throughout the district. She had a regular Monday meeting with the superintendent to let him know if there was a flare up at a different campus. She worked with principals sometimes in an oppositional kind of way. If a principal would not allow for the PTA to meet or um, to gather on campus. She was also working with and sometimes oppositionally, civil rights organizations, including the NAACP, which is interesting that she was a member of it, but then her job required her to sometimes kind of push back on NAACP demands about how fast the district should desegregate and what that should look like. So I think she came into the job with a great deal of capital, like like kind of knowledge capital on how to work with different groups of people, how to work with different races of people. And then also her community engagement involvement also helped as well. She was one of the founders of a political action group called Women on Target, and they helped to elect Tom Bradley. She was involved in the LAPD civilian commission. So, and this is way before we think about the civilian commission and we associate it with Black Lives Matter and things like that, but it was actually happening in the 70s. She was on the LA County Human Rights Commission. So she had so much experience that she could draw on and working with different people. So by the time she got to the Board of Trustees, she was in the latter part of her career in LA Unified. Um, and so she she knew how to work with a lot of people.
Yeah.
And I think that knowing how to sit back and assess um, the board
Mm.
is comes from knowing how to work with people in LA Unified.
Yeah. And one of the other kind of themes that I picked up throughout the book is this sense of responsibility. And so can you discuss a little bit about the responsibility Dr. Hampton carried as being the first Black woman in her role?
Yeah, so I say in the book that she she felt a sense of obligation to African Americans, whether that's students, that's faculty, that's parents on the outside, but she also felt a sense of responsibility for all folks of color and for women, and because there were white women on the board, but they weren't very vocal initially about race or gender issues. It doesn't come until after Hampton is really on the board that they start to speak up. And that's when the Jerry Brown appointments are more feminist and despised because they're feminist. Hampton does not profess, a belief in feminism, but she does support women. And I think that that was actually a brilliant move on her part, that she would play to the gender norm by cooking dinner for these white men and expressing a kind of moderate politics, because then what she was able to do was to gain the trust of all the different factions. So there were like three factions when Jerry Brown's appointees came in. So you had the holdovers, the conservative holdovers from the Reagan years. You had the Jerry Brown appointees, which were uber left. And then you had people like Hampton who were kind of somewhat stuck in the middle. She was not a Republican. She, didn't vote for Reagan. She was like the antithesis of what you would associate with Reagan, yet she was appointed by him, but she was not also a far left either. And so she was kind of plunk in the middle of all of them, and they all trusted her.
Yeah.
And I think because she took that responsibility so seriously, and then she worked with a lot of her allies. She had a number of allies of color that she worked with. So the first Latino male trustee, and then the second Black male trustee. They were on the board together for the longest, and they would work in tandem with each other. And then finally, I would say that I think part of her sense of responsibility was, and she says, you know, I figure I'm gonna be here. I might as well, get into this thing and really get to work. And I think that and she says, I know I'm the affirmative action trustee. Like, she embraces that as her identity instead of shying away from it. Where most people say, well, I'm here despite or
Mhm.
just because there's affirmative action doesn't mean I got here because of affirmative action. She's like, no, that's who I am. They appointed me because they wanted someone to help shepherd through affirmative action. I'm that person.
Yeah.
So instead of that kind of walking away from it and trying to distance herself, she embraced it. And I think that was one of her strengths.
Yeah. And so, talking about her prolific career, what were some of the most transformative changes implemented by Dr. Hampton?
Yeah. So I would say one of the things that she fought for was a thing called a balanced fee policy, which meant that if the university is going to raise tuition, they have to simultaneously look for ways to increase student aid. So she really fought for students to be able to get enough aid so they wouldn't carry debt. I'm a direct beneficiary of her advocacy. I received a state university grant that came about right after you made this impassioned plea for a balanced fee policy. So, I'm forever grateful to her in that regard. But she also fought for something as innocuous as a student payment plan in order to pay tuition in payments instead of upfront. Most of the other trustees, it was just off their radar that students were struggling financially, and she's like, yeah, of course they're struggling financially. The other thing that's was a tangible was that she helped to working with the first woman chancellor, Anne Reynolds. There was a 27% increase in the number of faculty of color that um, were hired and retained in the CSU, and you saw big gains with the student population. So Mexican American student population grew over 100% during that time period. African American, Asian American grew by, I think it was 25 or 30%. So there was these marked increases in the diversity of faculty and students in the Cal State system while she was on the board, and it has not been duplicated since. So she's made a huge mark, and then also, she put a lot of things in place. Well, she put in a lot of partnerships with LA Unified School District and the Cal State system, where Cal State faculty would teach on the campus of various LA Unified schools so that you could build a pipeline for students. She helped to create the California Academy of Math and Science that sits on the campus of Cal State Dominguez Hills. That was her brainchild, and she lobbied and got that done. And then also she served on the board for the California Community Foundation, which subsequently created the first healthcare clinic in Lawndale, Inglewood, so that they had the first ever healthcare clinic, and it's named in her honor.
Mm. And so it's such a big proponent of change. And as we see throughout history, right, we have swells of progress and then there's some snapbacks.
Yeah.
And so you analyze how white resentment and culture wars came to the fore in the 90s. So how did this end up influencing educational policy in California?
Yeah. So by the 1990s, we are in the grips of a recession. And typically, a recession brings out people's worst instincts, and they kind of fall back onto the kind of playbook of blame the immigrant, blame the person of color.
Mm.
And hastening all of this is these kind of concerted media attacks that are coming from conservative pundits and funded largely by conservative foundations. So you start to hear a lot of this dog whistling of the welfare queen and, people who are not taking personal responsibility. And then you couple all of this with a riot, with the 1992 riot after the Rodney King, and then also, you have Proposition 187, which is targeting, it's called Save Our State, but it's really blaming immigrants for the economic turmoil in California. And Pete Wilson's campaign was fledgling, and kind of flailing. And so, but he latched on to Proposition 187 and started to use this racist imagery, campaign ads where you would see Mexicans running across the border. And so you take all of those events together, they all kind of coalesce together. So you have an economic downturn, you have concerted media attacks, you have a governor who's blaming particular segments of the population, you have a riot. All of those things come together. And so there's an appetite to get rid of affirmative action because it's like, well, you people are burning down your own communities and tearing up property. Americans have a real thing for property. Like property is sacred. Human life is kind of secondary. and so all of those things kind of come together. And so when Proposition 209 is introduced on the ballot, and then what makes it even more curious is that you have a Black man as the mouthpiece for Proposition 209, which is Ward Connerly. What the public doesn't know is how much money Ward Connerly has been paid to be this mouthpiece. He receives $2.1 million to do this kind of work from the Bradley Foundation and the Olin Foundation. So there's a lot that the public does not know still about how we got to Proposition 209. We got there because there's this kind of anti-affirmative action entrepreneur in Ward Connerly who's kind of hastening this and making it, trying to legitimize it by being the Black face for this.
How can studying the historic battles around implementing affirmative action in higher education kind of help inform our current moment?
Yeah, so, with the Supreme Court decision last year to get rid of race-conscious admissions, folks might say, well, why is this even important? Well, all of this history is important because you need to see what the background was that it took to get rid of affirmative action even today. It's the same playbook because all of that I described about Ward Connerly, you could just transfer it to a man named Edward Blum, who was who worked for Ward Connerly. That's the irony of all of this. And so with the Harvard case, Edward Blum created an organization called Students for Fair Admission. Students for Fair Admission was supposed to be a group of concerned Harvard students who blasted affirmative action, saying that it was preventing Asian American students from getting into Harvard. Well, one, Harvard did not have any set-asides, like specific seat set-asides for particular races. That was outlawed with the Bakke decision in 1978. Quotas were outlawed way back. So that's this kind of false narrative that's been touted. The second thing is most of the membership that Blum had for Students for Fair Admission were not actual students at all. When he created the organization, he created it as a kind of membership organization where you only had to pay like $10. The general public could join it. And then he said, well, I have people he basically lied about his roster. His roster was mostly just the average person who might have been following his previous work in getting rid of affirmative action at UT Austin. So it's the same guy, and he's not a lawyer. He's a legal entrepreneur or a legal activist. That's kind of the way he describes himself. And he gets paid a regular salary from the American Enterprise Institute to do this kind of work to get rid of affirmative action and any race-based initiative across the country. So it's a similar type of play that Ward Connerly did in 96. Here we have in 2003, very similar case. In fact, my article about the anti-affirmative action industry was used in the amicus brief for this Harvard case. It was called a Coalition for Diverse Harvard, asked if I would sign on. And I was like, yeah, sure, no problem, because they did not realize how much money had been used to get rid of affirmative action, both in 96 and now in 2003. So yeah, there's a lot of shadiness but gets duplicated over and over again. But if you don't study that history, you're going to keep on falling victim to the same kind of traps. So, when folks ask me about, why is your book relevant in this moment? It's relevant in this moment because it shows you exactly what happened. And you're going to see in other states the rapid decline of the students of color on your campuses. That diversity is about to go, it's about to go down pretty dramatically. And what's even more startling is that you have people who are trying to overinterpret the Supreme Court case in order to say we need to get rid of race-based scholarships. So if I'm a donor and I put in place a scholarship for Black students at the University of Missouri, folks are trying to say, well, the Supreme Court said you can't use affirmative action in admission, so we got to get rid of your scholarship. It's like, but that has nothing to do with the scholarship, but because universities are so paranoid, rightfully so, about being in violation with the federal government or being doxxed, in social media, they're trying to get rid of or think of ways to get rid of these race-based scholarships along with all their DEI programs.
Yeah.
So, yeah, this history is super informative about the playbook because it's just going to get repeated because they know that nobody's reading and paying attention.
Yeah. And there's so much information in this book. There's so much that readers can take away. We've touched on some of those key important points, I think. But what do you hope readers take away from your book?
I really hope that readers first understand how much power trustees have. Trustees, governors, regents, like really understand that these folks are appointed specifically in the public institutions. They are appointed by governors. So that means that they're a political appointee. And no matter what the rules say about, that should be free from sectarian and political influence, because that's what the California Code says about how you should appoint a trustee. But they are appointed by someone who is a politician, and they're going to, oftentimes they use these appointments as gifts to patrons or to donors. There were a number of people who donated to the various governors. Claudia Hampton didn't donate to Ronald Reagan. She's one of the outliers. But the amount of power that they have oversight. That is what they're principally supposed to have. But they make policy, and they often make policy in absentia of the faculty experts or the students who are affected. And so there's this kind of trickle down from people who might have nothing to do with education whatsoever. A lot of times it's people in business who get these appointments, and then they're supposed to make policy. And it's like, well, how do you make policy if you don't know how the institution works? So I want readers to really understand how powerful the trustees are, and also how race and gender shapes these trustee appointments, and how people have to navigate this kind of identity issues with regards to these appointments, because Claudia Hampton had to not only deal with affirmative action in and of itself, but she had to deal with who she was as a Black woman. And it's important to have this diversity because it helps to make better policy. But I don't think we fully understand what the trustees do to begin with. And then you add the layer of identity onto that. I'm hoping people get out of the book also how much power is this kind of hidden hand of university governance that most of us don't see, but somehow we think presidents have power, and campus presidents don't have that much power relative to the trustees.
And one of the reasons kind of motivating you behind this book is that Dr. Hampton is one of those understudied women in history. So where should people go when they've finished your book and they want to learn more about Claudia Hampton?
Yeah, so I am actually working on I have a project, a digital project that I am working on and launching at the end of the year called Black Women's Educational Activism Project. Well, California Black Women Educational Activism Project. And so it's a multimedia project that would have images and audio, some video of Black women who were educational activists. And I'm narrowly defining educational activists to talk about people who dealt with policy.
Mhm.
So Claudia Hampton, Eva Patterson, ironically, Erica Huggins and Elaine Brown from the Black Panther Party, because their Oakland Community School ended up becoming part of Alameda County policy. And so looking at people who aren't necessarily school teachers or professors, but people who operated on the outside to help inform policy and shape policy in California, and particularly how Black women do this through community organizations.
That sounds exciting. I can't.
Yeah.
When do we hope it's going to launch?
Well, I'm working in phases. So I have the Hampton bit is ready to go. I'm trying to secure permissions for the other pieces. So I'm going to say end of the year is the target. So I'm going to say December 31st.
Okay.
I give myself some cushion.
And then where should people go to learn more about you and your scholarship?
Yeah, you can go directly to my website, which is Donna J. Nichol, NICOL.com. And there you can find links to not only purchase the book, but also you can hear audio clips of Claudia Hampton, as well as links to my research and also my work on conservative philanthropy, because that's my secondary area. And so I was involved with the Al Jazeera documentary, A Big Picture, in 2021, 22. You know, the COVID years, you start forgetting stuff. But it was a documentary explaining how philanthropy impacts education outcomes and health outcomes, and even political outcomes for African Americans in particular.
And is there anything we haven't covered today that you'd like future readers to know?
You know, I'm very curious. There was a section of the book that was the hardest part for me to write. And it was a section where I was talking about Claudia Hampton using this kind of long game strategy and a conflict between Black and Brown over the presidency at Cal State LA. I had a hard time writing that part, a very hard time. I think it took me months to write that section because I wanted to write it with a great deal of care. Mm-hmm. Because one thing that I'm always attentive to is how communities of color, when there's infighting between communities of color, and how that gets perceived and used and manipulated to have people go at one another. So I would like, one of my hopes is that readers read that and know that I struggled with this section. I struggled with it. Yeah, it was a tough one. And I had gone down so many winding paths because I was trying to be so responsible that I cut 15 pages of it. My editor was like, "Do you need all of this?" And I was like, "I'm scared." I mean, I literally was scared to write this and get it like to memorialize that section, but I'm okay with it now. I made peace with it, but that just know that writers do struggle even with the facts. Even presenting the facts, because there's a way you could write it that could slant it a particular way. And so just know that, I had some consternation with writing that section.
Well, for what it's worth, I do remember that section of the book, and I could glean, or I inferred, okay, she's being very careful with her language. She is trying to present facts. She is trying to be very considerate of both sides. So, at least from my perspective, I think you did a good job.
Oh, thank you, thank you. I mean, when the book first launched, and I had a book event, and someone asked me, conversation partner asked me about that section, and I just kept, oh, oh, oh. And she's like, "Are you okay?" I was like, "No, I'm not okay."
Well, I'm happy that to hear that you're in a better place with it now. Like I said, from at least my reading of it, I thought it was very well done, very kind of down the middle. So good job.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes. All right. So for all the listeners out there, you should definitely pick up a copy of Black Woman on Board. Dr. Nichol does a beautiful job sharing this complex, nuanced history of both Claudia Hampton and the fight for affirmative action in higher education in California. You will not be disappointed. Thank you again, Dr. Nichol.
Thank you again.
And there you have it, folks. Thanks again to Dr. Nichol for coming on and discussing Black Woman on Board. The book is currently available wherever fine titles are sold, and I highly recommend buying yourself a copy to learn about a fascinating woman and period in American history. Thanks, peeps. I'll see you next week. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed this episode of Civics and Coffee. If you want to hear more small snippets from American history, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to our next cup of coffee together.